The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Jefferson County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. It was a typical Wednesday in 1955, and Judge William Harrison adjusted his black robes as he prepared for another day of dispensing what he considered justice in his small southern town. At 62 years old, Judge Harrison had presided over this courthouse for nearly 2 decades. His thin gray hair was always neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses sat perfectly straight on his nose. The locals knew him as a strict man who ran his courtroom with unwavering authority and traditional Southern values. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. The wooden benches were filling up with people waiting for their cases to be called. The scratching of the court clerk's pen and the whispered conversations of lawyers created a familiar background noise that Judge Harrison had grown accustomed to over the years. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom as Judge Harrison entered. The routine was always the same. You'd handle traffic violations first, then minor infractions, and finally, the more serious cases. It was a system he had perfected, and he took pride in running an efficient courtroom. As he settled into his chair, Judge Harrison noticed something different about today's crowd. There seemed to be more colored people than usual sitting in the back of the courtroom, where local custom dictated they should be. He didn't give it much thought. As long as they maintained proper order, he wasn't concerned. The morning proceeded as usual. He handed out fines for speeding tickets, settled minor disputes between neighbors, and dealt with a handful of public intoxication cases. It was just before the lunch break when case number 47 was called. "The State versus Mary McLeod," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers, expecting to see another routine case. Instead, he saw a well-dressed black woman making her way to the front of the courtroom. She walked with remarkable poise, her head held high, wearing a navy blue dress and a small hat with a matching band. Something about her bearing made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. The charge was simple: disturbing the public peace for refusing to move to the back of a local bus. It was the kind of case Judge Harrison had heard dozens of times before, especially since the colored people had started getting ideas about challenging the natural order of things. "Mrs. McLeod," Judge Harrison began, not bothering to look up from the charge sheet, "you're charged with disturbing the peace and disrupting public transport. How do you plead?" "Dr. Bethune McLeod, if you please, Your Honor," the woman corrected him quietly but firmly. Her voice carried a refined quality that made Judge Harrison glance up sharply. "And I would like to explain the circumstances of this incident." Judge Harrison frowned at being corrected by a colored woman in his courtroom. He noticed she carried herself differently from the usual defendants he saw. There was no nervousness in her demeanor, no shuffling of feet or wringing of hands. Instead, she stood perfectly straight, her eyes meeting his with unwavering dignity. "The charge is quite clear, Mrs. Dr. McLeod," he said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe the title. "You refused to follow the driver's lawful instruction to move to the colored section of the bus. This caused a delay in the bus schedule and created a public disturbance." Around the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed subtly. The usual courthouse sounds had died down to complete silence. The white folks in the front rows were watching with mixed expressions of curiosity and disapproval, while the colored people in the back seemed to be holding their collective breath. Judge Harrison noticed several reporters had slipped into the courtroom, unusual for such a routine case. One of them was frantically scribbling notes, while another was trying to get a better view of the defendant. This attention irritated him. It was a simple matter that should have been handled in 5 minutes. "Your Honor, if I may," the woman began again, but Judge Harrison had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this case turn into some kind of platform for rabble-rousing. He'd seen enough of that lately with all this talk about civil rights and changing the old ways. Little did Judge Harrison know that this seemingly routine Wednesday morning was about to become one of the most significant moments in his judicial career, and the dignified woman standing before him would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, respect, and human dignity. Judge Harrison drummed his fingers on the wooden bench, eager to wrap up this case before lunch. The morning heat was beginning to seep into the courtroom, and he could feel small beads of sweat forming under his collar. The ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, doing little to combat the southern humidity. "Mrs. McLeod," he began, deliberately ignoring her earlier correction about her title, "the law is quite clear on this matter. Public transportation in this county operates under specific rules that ensure order and efficiency. He paused to remove his glasses and clean them with his handkerchief, a habit he'd developed over years on the bench when he wanted to appear especially thoughtful. The woman standing before him remained perfectly still, her handbag held firmly in both hands. Judge Harrison noticed that unlike most defendants, she didn't fidget or show signs of nervousness. If anything, there was something in her bearing that made him slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Your Honor." She spoke again, her voice clear and educated. "I believe there are important factors in this case that deserve consideration." Several people in the courtroom leaned forward, straining to hear her words. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her typewriter, ready to capture every word. Judge Harrison felt a flash of irritation. In his experience, these situations needed to be handled quickly and firmly. Any sign of leniency would only encourage more troublemaking. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple," he declared, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to shut down any further discussion. "You refused to follow the driver's legitimate instructions. You caused a delay in the bus schedule. Your actions disrupted public order." The young clerk sitting below his bench shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Harrison noticed the boy seemed agitated, repeatedly looking between a newspaper on his desk and the defendant. But the judge had no patience for distractions today. "The court hereby fines you $50, Judge Harrison announced, reaching for his gavel. "Pay the clerk before leaving the courthouse." He considered the matter settled and was already looking down at the next case file. But something unusual happened. Instead of the typical rushed shuffling of someone eager to escape his courtroom, he heard murmurs rippling through the audience. Even more surprising, several of the white reporters who usually dozed through minor cases were suddenly alert, their pencils scratching furiously across their notepads. The defendant remained standing, perfectly composed. "Your Honor," she said once more, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made several heads turn, "I believe you might want to reconsider your hasty judgment." Judge Harrison felt his face flush with anger. In 20 years on the bench, he never had anyone, white or colored, challenge his authority so directly. He looked up, ready to cite her for contempt of court, when he noticed something odd. The young clerk was now standing, clutching a newspaper in trembling hands. His face had gone pale, and he seemed desperate to get the judge's attention. Even the bailiff, usually a statue of indifference, was watching the scene with unusual interest. "Mrs. McLeod," Judge Harrison said, his voice sharp with warning, "this court has made its ruling. Unless you wish to add a contempt charge to your fine, I suggest you—" "Your Honor." The clerk's voice cracked as he finally found the courage to speak up. He hurried forward, the newspaper shaking in his hands. "Sir, there's something you need to see." Judge Harrison frowned at the interruption, but something in the clerk's urgent manner made him pause. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow their lazy spinning, as if the very air was holding its breath. The woman, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, though the judge didn't know it yet, stood patiently, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She appeared to be the only person in the courtroom who wasn't tense with anticipation. As the clerk approached the bench with the newspaper, Judge Harrison had no way of knowing that the next few moments would shatter his carefully ordered world. His hasty judgment was about to become a harsh mirror, reflecting back decades of prejudice and presumption that he'd never thought to question. The young clerk's hands trembled as he placed the newspaper clipping on Judge Harrison's bench. The paper was folded to show a photograph and headline from last month's edition of the Washington Post. Judge Harrison's eyes fell first on the image, the same woman who stood before him now, except in the photograph she was standing between Eleanor Roosevelt and President Truman at a White House ceremony. The judge's face paled as he read the headline. Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune appointed to International Development Advisory Board. The article described her as one of the most influential educators in American history, founder of a college, and advisor to 3 United States presidents. Judge Harrison's hands began to shake slightly as he looked from the newspaper to the woman before him. The courtroom remained deadly quiet, the silence broken only by the gentle whoosh of the rotating fans above. Even the usual creaking of the old courthouse floors had stopped as everyone seemed to be holding perfectly still. "Dr. Bethune," he managed to say, his voice suddenly hoarse. The title that he had dismissed earlier now felt heavy on his tongue. I see there may have been some oversight in this case. Dr. Bethune smiled gently, but her eyes held a firmness that made the judge shift uncomfortably in his seat. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. As I was attempting to explain, this incident represents more than a simple matter of bus seating. It speaks to the dignity of every American citizen. The reporters in the courtroom were now writing frantically, their pencils practically smoking across their notepads. Judge Harrison could already imagine tomorrow's headlines. Here he was, a small-town judge, having just fined one of the most distinguished black leaders in America, a woman who had the ear of presidents. His mind raced back through the previous 15 minutes. He remembered his dismissive tone, his refusal to let her speak, his deliberate ignoring of her title. Each memory now felt like a physical blow to his stomach. The court clerk will provide me with more details about this incident, Judge Harrison announced, trying to regain his composure. He was desperately searching for a way to recover from his tremendous blunder. As the clerk shuffled through papers, Dr. Bethune spoke again, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Your Honor, I've spent my life building bridges between communities. When I founded Bethune Cookman College, I did so with the belief that education could overcome prejudice. When I advised Presidents Roosevelt, Truman, and Hoover, I spoke of a future where dignity and respect would not depend on the color of one's skin. Judge Harrison noticed that several white members of the audience were now looking at Dr. Bethune with newfound respect, perhaps even awe. The black spectators in the back of the courtroom sat straighter, pride evident in their bearing. The bailiff, who had worked in the courthouse for over 2 decades, was staring open-mouthed at the scene unfolding before him. He had known Dr. Bethune's name and reputation, but had failed to recognize her when she first entered the courtroom, just as they all had. Dr. Bethune, Judge Harrison said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, I believe we need to review this case more thoroughly. The court apologizes for its hasty conclusions. The words felt insufficient even as he spoke them. She nodded graciously, but then did something unexpected. Instead of sitting down, she remained standing and addressed the court. Your Honor, if you'll permit me, I believe this moment offers us all an opportunity. What happened here today, the assumptions, the quick judgments, the dismissal of human dignity, these are the very things that must change if our nation is to move forward. The judge found himself nodding, though he hardly realized he was doing so. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to have risen several degrees, yet no one moved toward the doors. Every person present sensed they were witnessing a moment of profound significance. As Judge Harrison looked down at the newspaper again, then back at Dr. Bethune, he realized that his entire understanding of order, justice, and authority had been shaken to its core in the span of just a few minutes. What had started as a routine case had become a mirror reflecting his own prejudices, and he could no longer look away from what it showed him. Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers during the lunch recess, his sandwich untouched on the desk before him. The morning's events played over and over in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. His comfortable world of fixed rules and clear boundaries had been turned upside down in the span of a single morning. Through his office window, you could see reporters gathering on the courthouse steps. Some were from local papers, but he spotted others from bigger cities too. Word was spreading fast about what had happened in his courtroom. The story of how a small-town judge had tried to fine one of America's most respected black educators was probably already racing across telegraph wires to newspapers across the country. He picked up the newspaper clipping again, reading it for what must have been the 20th time. Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune's accomplishments filled nearly half a page. Founded a college with just $1.50 and 6 students. Turned it into a fully accredited college with over 1,000 students. Advised 3 presidents. Started schools and organizations across the country. Fought for women's rights and civil rights for decades. Judge? His clerk knocked softly at the door. I found some more information about Dr. Bethune that you asked for. The young man entered carrying a stack of papers and magazines. He laid them carefully on the judge's desk, and Harrison began to look through them. Each new article he read made him feel smaller and smaller. Here was a picture of Dr. Bethune with Eleanor Roosevelt, both women smiling as they worked together on a national education project. Another showed her receiving an award from a governor. A magazine article described how she had started her first school using discarded crates for desks and charcoal for pencils. She visits the White House regularly, the clerk said quietly. They say President Truman never makes a decision about civil rights without asking her opinion first. Judge Harrison pushed his chair back from his desk and walked to the window. Down below, he could see more people gathering. Word had spread through the black community about Dr. Bethune's presence, and small groups were forming on the courthouse lawn. They weren't protesting or causing trouble. They were just waiting, hoping to catch a glimpse of this remarkable woman. How did I not know? He muttered to himself. How did I not see? But he knew the answer. He hadn't seen because he hadn't wanted to see. For 20 years, he had looked at every black person who entered his courtroom the same way, as someone less worthy of his time and attention. He had never bothered to look deeper, to consider their individual stories, their dignity, their humanity. The weight of his morning's behavior pressed down on him like a physical force. He remembered how he had dismissed her title, ignored her attempts to speak, and rushed to judgment without even pretending to listen to her side of the story. What kind of justice was that? His eyes fell on a framed copy of his oath of office hanging on the wall. To administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. The words seemed to mock him now. How many times had he failed to live up to that oath? How many other people had he judged unfairly, their stories unheard, their dignity ignored? The clerk cleared his throat nervously. Judge Harrison, the afternoon session starts in 10 minutes. Dr. Bethune's case is still technically open. Harrison nodded slowly. He knew he had to do something to address this situation, but what? A simple apology seemed insultingly inadequate. How do you apologize for not just a single act of prejudice, but for a lifetime of them? He straightened his robes and adjusted his tie, movements he had made thousands of times before. But today they felt different. Today, for the first time in 20 years, he felt uncertain about his role, his authority, his understanding of justice itself. As he prepared to return to the courtroom, Judge Harrison realized that the true defendant today wasn't Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. It was his own prejudices and preconceptions that were on trial. And in that case, he had already found himself guilty. Late into the evening, Judge Harrison sat in his home library, surrounded by open books and scattered papers. His dinner had gone cold, forgotten on a side table as he immersed himself in learning about the woman he had so quickly dismissed in his courtroom. The more he read, the more amazed and ashamed he became. A thick book titled Who's Who in American Education lay open on his lap. Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune's entry filled 2 full pages. Born to former slaves in South Carolina, worked in the fields as a child, walked 5 miles each day to attend a tiny missionary school, won a scholarship, became a teacher, started a school for little black girls with nothing but faith and determination. $5 students, he read aloud, shaking his head in wonder. That tiny school had grown into Bethune-Cookman College, now one of the most respected black colleges in America. His fingers traced the words on the page, trying to absorb the magnitude of such an achievement. Next to him lay a pile of newspaper clippings his clerk had gathered. One showed Dr. Bethune standing beside Eleanor Roosevelt at a women's rights conference. Another captured her speaking to a crowd of thousands at a civil rights rally. A third showed her receiving an award from a group of international educators. His wife Sarah entered the library, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She had been unusually quiet since the incident, but tonight she spoke up. "William," she said softly, "I remember when a colored woman came to our door last year, asking for donations for a girls' school. I turned her away without a second thought." Harrison looked up, seeing the same regret in his wife's eyes that he felt in his heart. "We've been blind," he replied, "not just to their struggles, but to their achievements, their dignity, their humanity." He picked up another book, this one about Dr. Bethune's work with 3 different presidents. She had advised Roosevelt during the Great Depression, helped Truman understand civil rights issues, and worked with Hoover on child welfare programs. All this while building her college and fighting for education and justice. The clock struck midnight, but Judge Harrison kept reading. He learned about the National Council of Negro Women, which Dr. Bethune had founded to give black women a stronger voice in national affairs. He read about her trips to Europe and Africa, representing America at international conferences. Each new fact made his courtroom behavior seem more shameful. His eyes fell on a quote from Dr. Bethune in a magazine article. The true measure of our progress as a society is not how we treat the powerful, but how we treat those we think have no power. Harrison stood up and walked to his study window. The street outside was quiet now, but he knew tomorrow would bring more reporters, more questions, more scrutiny. Yet somehow, that didn't seem as important anymore. Something deeper was happening inside him. He returned to his desk and began to write. First, he listed every black person he could remember sentencing in the past year. Then he pulled out their case files, studying each one with new eyes. How many times had he handed out harsher sentences without even realizing his bias? How many stories had he failed to hear? As the night grew deeper, Judge Harrison kept working. He read about civil rights laws, about education initiatives, about the struggle for equality that had been happening right under his nose while he sat in his comfortable judge's chair, seeing only what he wanted to see. At dawn, his wife found him still in the library, now surrounded by even more books and papers. But something was different about him. The proud, certain man who had always known his place in the world was gone. In his place was someone humbler, someone seeking to understand rather than to judge. "I need to do more than just apologize," he told Sarah as she brought him breakfast. "I need to change. Not just my actions, but my whole way of thinking." Sarah nodded, understanding that her husband's late-night transformation was just the beginning of a much longer journey. The man who would walk into the courthouse today was not the same one who had sat on the bench earlier that week. He had begun to see with new eyes, and there would be no going back to his old ways of seeing. The courthouse was more crowded than it had ever been. People packed the wooden benches, stood along the walls, and spilled out into the hallways. News photographers jostled for position, their cameras ready. The air was thick with tension and expectation. Judge Harrison had called for a special session of court, something he had never done in his 20 years on the bench. He stood in his chambers, adjusting his robes one final time. His hands weren't shaking anymore. For the first time in days, he felt completely certain about what he needed to do. "It's time, Your Honor," his clerk said softly. As Harrison entered the courtroom, the usual cry of "all rise" seemed louder than ever before. He noticed Dr. Bethune sitting in the front row, dignified as always, her expression gentle but serious. Next to her sat several representatives from civil rights organizations, and behind them, a mix of black and white citizens from the community. Instead of taking his seat at the bench, Judge Harrison remained standing. The room fell silent, every eye fixed upon him. Even the photographers temporarily forgot their cameras, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. "Before this court proceeds," Harrison began, his voice clear and steady, "I have a statement to make." He removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Dr. Bethune. "Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, would you please stand?" She rose gracefully, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to frame her in a gentle glow. 3 days ago, Harrison continued, this court committed not just an error of judgment, but an offense against justice itself. I didn't simply fail to recognize you, Dr. Bethune. I failed to recognize your humanity, your dignity, and your right to be treated with respect. A murmur ran through the crowd. No one had ever heard Judge Harrison speak like this before. You stand before us as one of our nation's most distinguished educators, a trusted advisor to presidents, and a tireless advocate for justice. But more than that, you stand as a living testament to the principle that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Harrison stepped down from the bench, something he had never done during a session. He walked to where Dr. Bethune stood. This court not only dismisses all charges against you, but I personally and publicly apologize for my behavior. My actions reflected not just personal prejudice, but a deeper failing in our system of justice. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Several reporters were writing frantically, while others simply stared, their pencils forgotten in their hands. But an apology alone is not enough, Harrison continued. Actions must follow words. Therefore, I am announcing several changes in how this court will operate. He turned to address the entire courtroom now, his voice growing stronger with each word. First, this court will establish a review committee to examine all cases involving racial elements from the past 5 years. Second, we will implement new procedures to ensure equal treatment for all who come before this bench. And third, I am requesting that Dr. Bethune, if she is willing, serve as an advisor to help us create a more just and equitable court system." Dr. Bethune's face showed no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the significance of the moment. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I accept your apology and your invitation. True justice begins with the recognition of our shared humanity. Today, you have taken an important step toward that recognition." Harrison extended his hand to Dr. Bethune. As they shook hands, flashbulbs popped around the courtroom, capturing a moment that would appear in newspapers across the country. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, a white Southern judge and a black educator, standing as equals before the law. It was more than just a handshake. It was a sign that change was possible, that hearts and minds could be opened, that justice could become more than just a word carved on a courthouse wall. 5 years had passed since that memorable day in the courthouse. Judge William Harrison sat in his new office at the State Judicial Training Center, looking at the framed newspaper article hanging on his wall. The photograph showed him shaking hands with Dr. Bethune, a moment that had changed not just his life, but the lives of many others. The building around him buzzed with activity. Young judges from across the state came here for training, and Harrison had made sure that understanding prejudice and promoting equal justice were key parts of their education. The program had become a model for other states, with visitors coming from as far as California to learn about their methods. On his desk sat a letter he had received that morning from a young black law student. "Your story," the student wrote, "taught me that real change is possible, even in the hearts of those who seem most set in their ways." Harrison touched the letter gently, remembering how far he had come from being that prideful judge who had tried to find Dr. Bethune. His old courthouse had changed too. The segregated seating was gone. Black lawyers now argued cases regularly before the bench. The clerks and staff reflected the diversity of the community. Even the paintings on the walls had changed. Alongside the portraits of old white judges now hung images of important civil rights leaders, including a beautiful portrait of Dr. Bethune herself. Harrison picked up his walking cane and moved to the window. Below, he could see a group of law students entering the building for today's session. Black and white students walked together, talking and laughing as they climbed the steps. Such a simple thing, he thought, but one that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The review committee he had established had examined over 300 past cases. Many sentences were reduced, some convictions were overturned, and dozens of people had received new hearings. Each case represented a small step toward justice, a small piece of redemption. His secretary knocked on the door. "Judge Harrison, your 3 o'clock is here. The new judges are ready for your talk." He smiled, gathering his notes. This was his favorite part of the week, sharing his story with new judges, helping them understand how easily prejudice could blind them to true justice. He had given this talk hundreds of times now, but it never got easier. Each time, he felt the same shame when describing his treatment of Dr. Bethune, and the same sense of hope when talking about what had changed since then. As he walked to the lecture hall, Harrison passed a wall of photographs showing important moments in the state's judicial history. Near the end was a series of images from that day 5 years ago: the crowded courtroom, the public apology, the handshake that had made headlines across the country. Dr. Bethune had passed away 2 years after their courthouse encounter, but her influence lived on. The advisory committee she had helped establish continued to monitor the courts for signs of racial bias. Her suggestions had led to changes in everything from jury selection to sentencing guidelines. Even the language used in the courtroom had changed, becoming more respectful and inclusive. Harrison entered the lecture hall, looking out at the faces of the young judges. Some were black, some white, some from other backgrounds, all ready to learn from the mistakes and transformation of an old judge who had once thought he knew everything about justice. "Good afternoon," he began, setting his notes on the podium. "I'm here to tell you a story about a day when justice herself came into my courtroom, though I was too blind to recognize her at first. It's a story about prejudice and power, about dignity and change, and about how true justice begins with seeing the humanity in every person who stands before you." As he spoke, Harrison could almost feel Dr. Bethune's presence, her quiet dignity still teaching lessons about justice and humanity. The shame of that day had never fully left him, but it had been transformed into something powerful, a tool for teaching, a force for change, a reminder that it's never too late to open one's eyes and heart to true justice. And somewhere, he liked to think, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was smiling, knowing that her brief encounter with a prejudiced small-town judge had helped create ripples of change that would continue long after both of them were gone. Judge Harrison drummed his fingers on the wooden bench, eager to wrap up this case before lunch. The morning heat was beginning to seep into the courtroom, and he could feel small beads of sweat forming under his collar. The ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, doing little to combat the southern humidity. Mrs. McLeod, he began, deliberately ignoring her earlier correction about her title. The law is quite clear on this matter. Public transportation in this county operates under specific rules that ensure order and efficiency. He paused to remove his glasses and clean them with his handkerchief, a habit he'd developed over years on the bench when he wanted to appear especially thoughtful. The woman standing before him remained perfectly still, her handbag held firmly in both hands. Judge Harrison noticed that unlike most defendants, she didn't fidget or show signs of nervousness. If anything, there was something in her bearing that made him slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Your Honor." She spoke again, her voice clear and educated. "I believe there are important factors in this case that deserve consideration." Several people in the courtroom leaned forward, straining to hear her words. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her typewriter, ready to capture every word. Judge Harrison felt a flash of irritation. In his experience, these situations needed to be handled quickly and firmly. Any sign of leniency would only encourage more troublemaking. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple," he declared, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to shut down any further discussion. "You refused to follow the driver's legitimate instructions. You caused a delay in the bus schedule. Your actions disrupted public order." The young clerk sitting below his bench shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Harrison noticed the boy seemed agitated, repeatedly looking between a newspaper on his desk and the defendant. But the judge had no patience for distractions today. "The court hereby fines you $50, Judge Harrison announced, reaching for his gavel. "Pay the clerk before leaving the courthouse." He considered the matter settled and was already looking down at the next case file. But something unusual happened. Instead of the typical rushed shuffling of someone eager to escape his courtroom, he heard murmurs rippling through the audience. Even more surprising, several of the white reporters who usually dozed through minor cases were suddenly alert, their pencils scratching furiously across their notepads. The defendant remained standing, perfectly composed. "Your Honor," she said once more, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made several heads turn, "I believe you might want to reconsider your hasty judgment." Judge Harrison felt his face flush with anger. In 20 years on the bench, he never had anyone, white or colored, challenge his authority so directly. He looked up, ready to cite her for contempt of court, when he noticed something odd. The young clerk was now standing, clutching a newspaper in trembling hands. His face had gone pale, and he seemed desperate to get the judge's attention. Even the bailiff, usually a statue of indifference, was watching the scene with unusual interest. "Mrs. McLeod," Judge Harrison said, his voice sharp with warning, "this court has made its ruling. Unless you wish to add a contempt charge to your fine, I suggest you—" "Your Honor." The clerk's voice cracked as he finally found the courage to speak up. He hurried forward, the newspaper shaking in his hands. "Sir, there's something you need to see." Judge Harrison frowned at the interruption, but something in the clerk's urgent manner made him pause. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow their lazy spinning, as if the very air was holding its breath. The woman, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, though the judge didn't know it yet, stood patiently, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She appeared to be the only person in the courtroom who wasn't tense with anticipation. As the clerk approached the bench with the newspaper, Judge Harrison had no way of knowing that the next few moments would shatter his carefully ordered world. His hasty judgment was about to become a harsh mirror, reflecting back decades of prejudice and presumption that he'd never thought to question.